Now, Brian Trueman's story is not just the story of one man, it's the story of the relationship between two nations, one in Europe and the other in Africa. A man whose enormous energy and extraordinary ability to bring people together has resulted in a string of successful charity works. But charity hasn't been Brian's only purpose. He has used his position as a British Nigerian as a platform to try to make the world a better place between black and white races and to shine a light on injustice and oppression everywhere, including places like South Africa. In his life and relationships, he celebrates the rich and diverse cultural heritage of both Britain and Nigeria. And every day the tributes pour into him, not so much on the pages of newspapers or on the airwaves, but in a whispered thank you and in the look of gratitude from so many for so much that's gone unrecorded. Well, let's cross over to our London studios now and speak to Brian Trueman. Brian, thank you indeed for joining us. Let's begin with your early life. You were born in Enugu in southeastern Nigeria, the second of 3 children. Set the scene for us.
Well, actually, the youngest of 3, my sister Leslie, my brother Alec, and myself. My father moved to Nigeria in the early 50s as a water engineer, drilling for water and planting wells and subartificial wells. Farming industry, working in World Health and the World Bank Organization. And I was born 2nd of February 1960 in Enugu Hospital, and that's where I entered the world. Beautiful place. I absolutely love and adore Nigeria. I love the Nigerians deeply. I think they totally misunderstood, and I think bad press has really tainted that nation, but it's not true. They've got such a beautiful heart, kindness that goes beyond understanding. They give out of love rather than anything else, and everything that I've experienced of Nigerians has been amazing. It's been friendship that's so deep, like my friendship with you.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your sort of background, more about your background. I mean, would you say that you had a privileged upbringing, growing up in Enugu in Nigeria? And you also, of course, lived in Kano in northern Nigeria.
Yeah, that's right. Privileged life, I don't know. My mum and dad were very much down to earth. There was a freedom with mum and dad to just be who you wanted to be. And I think the culture of Nigeria just became my lifestyle. I was speaking fluent Igbo before I could speak fluent English, and where we were in Enugu, and then we moved out of Enugu. The first place we stayed was Hilltop, and then into Eki, and then back into Enugu. But during the time, my father, working in the south of Nigeria, would travel around. We would stay in Enugu. If he moved into the northern part of Nigeria, then we would relocate to Kano. And I became very much the culture of Nigeria. I grew up with everybody around me. I was no different. My skin color may have been different, but nothing else was different at all. All my friends, black and white. I just grew up colorblind, and I've stayed that way all my life. And I think that part of my life in Nigeria gave me a richness of life that I don't think I would have otherwise had. So, privilege from that point of view, definitely. But just an ordinary person, just enjoying life and growing up, and I don't know what to add to that.
You've answered it fairly well. But I mean, do you recall the schools that you attended in that period? I mean, I expect you were, as you said, a minority white boy in a predominantly black school.
Yeah, definitely. The school I went to, I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I just know yes, it was predominantly black. When I was in Eki and around everybody there, you know, I think to talk about colour just doesn't really gel with me. What was my life was my life, and I just grew up in that environment, and I had such relaxed parents who just allowed me to be me, which I think was an incredible thing. My mother's love, my father's strength. He, you know, great guys. So
well, just to refresh your memory there, Brian, based on the research that I did, I think you attended a school in Enugu called All Saints School, and from the photographs that you sent to me,
that's right. Yeah.
I think clearly that was the school. But what do you remember of your time in those schools during that period? I mean, was it a happy period for you? Were you bullied? Because, of course, you were a minority. And, I mean, for those of us who went to school abroad, internationally, I mean, we were always the minority blacks in majority white schools. And the sense was always that you were sort of picked on. Did you get that same reaction when you were in a white boy in a minority white boy in a black school in Nigeria?
No, I didn't. Absolutely not. Everything that I can clearly remember was just great fun. You know, just my friends were Nigerians, and that was it. You know, they were just friends, whether Nigerian or black or white, doesn't matter. They were friends, and never had any bad time at school. Always really, really enjoyed the school environment. I know we always started at 7 in the morning and sort of finished around 12 because of the heat. And then we all used to go off down to the Enugu Sports Club and just stay in the water all day. So it was a fabulous time. And it was a shame that war brought it to an end.
Yes, of course, we will talk about what happened when the war finally broke out. But was that the period, would you say, that laid the foundation for your activism, if I could call it that, and your colour-blind philosophy?
For sure. I think the first 7 years of any person's life, really puts the character into the person. I remember when I came back to the United Kingdom and started school here, they didn't call it culture shock then, but I definitely had culture shock. I didn't fit in. I struggled for years settling into the United Kingdom because my heart was in Africa, and I'd sort of grown up in that environment. So culturally, it was totally different.
Well, I'd like to sort of later in the program talk about when you did return to the UK after your time sort of in Nigeria. But as you mentioned, you also lived in northern Nigeria, which was quite different, I would imagine, culturally, from living in the southeast.
Oh yeah, very, very strong Muslim. I always remember the people singing and calling to prayer. Heat, oh my goodness. Yeah, I always remember Kano just being extraordinarily hot and dusty. Yeah, I mean, if they're memories that go back a long way, but those really do stick in my mind. But again, we weren't ever in Kano for long periods of time. So to build friendships up there, that didn't happen in the sense that the friendships I developed in Enugu. Enugu really was more the family home.
Yes, I can see that from a lot of the photographs and so on that you sent through. But painting a slightly broader picture from this thriving world of idealistic living, Brian, was there a form of, if I might call it, unspoken apartheid, if you like, between the blacks and whites living in Nigeria in those days, coming off the back of colonialism? Or was it so much more convivial as opposed to, for instance, apartheid South Africa, which was divided very much along racial lines in a whole range of ways?
Yeah, when I look back, my dad commanded a lot of respect just for the person who he was, but he never flaunted that. He just got on, and he had a lot of camaraderie with everybody that worked with him, either black or white. So we never ever had any kind of that, even hidden, black to white, white to black. Didn't see it at all. We had a great cook called Christopher, and his whole family, Beatrice, his wife, and Imogen, his child. They were part of the family, and you know, they lived in our house. It was just a great family, an extended family. So, and Julius, I mean, he was a guy that looked after me, and yeah, boy, I wish I could see him now. I'd say sorry a lot, that's for sure. Because
well, what would you be apologizing for?
Mum used
Pray
to tell me some
tell.
great stories about Julius.
What would you be apologizing for?
Oh, I don't know. I was ever so mischievous. I nearly set fire to the house once, and got rescued by him. And then a policeman turned up at the door that my dad had arranged. I didn't know. And sort of Dad said, "I think you need to answer the door." So I answered the door, and there's this policeman dressed up, and he said, "Are you Brian Trueman? Have you been playing with fire?" And I thought, oh my goodness, you know. So yeah, other things. I used to play out in the jungle area, and snakes would appear and spiders would appear. And I remember one time Julius jumped over my head quickly and just with a stick beat a snake. So yeah, he looked after me. But I did run him ragged. I was into everything, you know, climb trees and fall out of trees. I'd chase chickens and try to catch them and end up tripping over and putting myself in hospital for 2 days unconscious. And yeah, just a normal kid really, I suppose.
Yeah, I suppose I mean, knowing you now, I mean, you're quite a gregarious guy. Never mind the fact that you seem very calm on air. You're usually quite a very sort of boisterous and very friendly person in a very sort of big sort of way. But you mentioned that you spoke Igbo fluently. I suppose I should ask you to hold that thought. Let's talk about it when we come back. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with the British Nigerian Brit, Brian Trueman. Stay with us. Let's speak some more now with Brian Trueman, the British Nigerian Brit, who's done so much to bring the two cultures together, and for whom we were playing that music. And I imagine you were tapping your foot there, Brian.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, love it.
Drum that captures your imagination.
Sorry, I lost you there.
I asked the question, what is it about the drum
Yeah, certainly.
that captures your imagination?
I remember where we lived out in Eki, every night the drums were playing, and it became just part of life. So when I listen to drums now, it just makes me a beautiful place, a place that's, for me, a joy, a peace. I just absolutely love anything that has got drum rhythm and drum bass. It's just my go-to place for relaxation. My wife Linda doesn't quite get that, but for me it's brilliant. So the loudness of the drums, everything, it just, I think, takes me off the planet. It just calms my mind and just lets me I don't know, one thing that I really believe Nigeria gave me, probably the greatest gift that Nigeria gave me, was a sense of spirituality and a freedom to explore that spirituality. And I certainly believe the drum has that spiritual effect. So yeah, I don't know, it's just an energy. So yeah.
And so, going beyond the drum, I mean, I expect that, living in Nigeria, Nigeria has, I mean, as you correctly pointed out, very rich musical culture. I expect you were listening to a variety of African as well as European music, enjoying that with both Nigerian and British friends. But you and your family then left Nigeria in 1967, just as the Civil War was breaking out. What do you recall of that chaotic, bloody period in Nigeria's history and the exodus of families like your own from Nigeria?
What I can briefly remember, and it happened ever so quickly, is that a sort of a panic and a tension came in, and the decision was made between my mum and dad that my mum and I needed to leave. My brother and sister, Leslie and Alec, were at boarding school in England. So we left ever so quickly. We left everything behind, everything that we only took the bare minimum. So we came back in '67, but my father stayed. My father stayed till 1972 and tried to rescue the business and keep the business functioning out there. But over that period of time, the money just stopped flowing, and eventually my dad had to come back to the United Kingdom. He got a company over here and just carried on doing what he knew best, and that was drilling for water and irrigation, with a heart to go back to Nigeria if the door opened. And I know he went back several times later in the 70s. So yeah, it was a very quick and abrupt exodus for me and for my mum.
And I mean, let's just be clear on what your father...
My dad carried a tremendous sadness.
Right. Well, let's just be clear on what your father was actually doing in Nigeria. He was a sort of a water engineer, was he? He was running a company called Balakani, which essentially worked with sort of putting water pumps and irrigation and all that across Nigeria and many parts of Africa. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. The company Balakani started back in the 50s. I think he came to Nigeria in 52, 53, and just after Alec was born, and he established a network across the country. There were projects that came directly from the World Health and the World Bank organization, and so he just put in the boreholes where they were needed to be done. Obviously, geological surveys had to be carried out, and yeah, it's a great industry. It's a lot about water that is quite amazing.
Well, maybe you guys ought to pack your bags and come back to Nigeria, because there's still a water problem here. But I mean, let's just go back to that period when you left Nigeria as a result of the Civil War and returned to the UK. You touched on this earlier when we were talking. Was it hard for you to leave all your friends and the things you'd become used to growing up?
Absolutely. You leave somewhere that's been home all your life. So you've just left your heart really behind, and yeah, friendships. Friendships with yourselves and your family. So many lost items. Not just the material things that we lost, but the way of life, the way things were done, and suddenly we came back into a European culture which was totally unfamiliar to me. So I really struggled, and I remember as a young lad saying, "Can we go back to Nigeria? Can we go back to Nigeria?" I was always asking that. I just wanted to go home. But that never transpired, and here we are all these years later, and I'm still as much a Nigerian now as I was then. So,
well, I mean, talking about being a Nigerian, there have been a number of people in the studio here who would like you, they want to know if you remember any Nigerian language words, and if you do, would you mind communicating that? Because of course that was the first language that you said you were familiar with as a child. I imagine, obviously it's been a very, very long time. I mean, you left Nigeria, well, although you did come back, but you left when you were quite young.
Yeah. No, I can only remember greetings like Kedu and Aduma, but I never forget this one, right? And I probably heard this a million times more, and I'm sure kids can relate to this, is the word no, mba. So that used to be said to be a lot.
Okay, well, he's happy now. He's heard you say those words.
But I haven't remembered all
and
the other
that's of course, the person who was asking that is our guest producer and Arise analyst, Tony Amadi. So he's grinning from ear to ear. He's quite happy to have heard you say that. But even after you returned to the UK, Brian, you continued your relationship with many Africans and Nigerians, didn't you? You met them, you socialized with them.
Yeah.
How important was that social life in keeping your memories of growing up in Nigeria alive? This sort of social conjuncture, if you like, going on with you at the time.
When you grow up in a different culture, that culture becomes part of who you are. So it doesn't matter where you're in the world, that culture will still be a part of you. So when I moved to Salisbury in the United Kingdom, just predominantly white, there was hardly any ethnic minorities whatsoever, and that was a shame. But I remember Emeka, he was called Gregory then, came, and we had our time together. He came and stayed for quite a while, and I actually was able to take him to school. He came to the school that I was at, and we were just the best of friends, you know. We were just mates. We were like brothers, and just had so much fun. And the crowd that I was with, my friends here in England that I'd made, they accepted Gregory just the way he was, and I'm sure he doesn't want to be called Gregory, Emeka, and that was just a beautiful part of life. And I remember years later when I met Emeka, he put his arm around me. He'd been with me for about a day, and he said, and these are probably the most profound words I've heard from somebody who's just a fellow Nigerian, is that I'm glad to see you're still colourblind. That really sort of spoke a lot to me. You know, it really touched my heart to have that compliment, which I think was one of the most beautiful compliments you can give a person. The world's so full of prejudice, so full of you know, just finding fault and a lot of negative out there. But I tell you what, friendship like that, it lasts a lifetime. It never changes. Because when two hearts have walked together for that many years, how can any prejudice enter into that? So I don't see black or white. You know, this is a beautiful world we live in. 100%, we're all humans. So why do we have problems with colour? You know, just...
Well, hold that thought,
thing.
Brian. Hold that thought. We'll be talking some more.
That,
You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our jolly chat with the British Nigerian Brit, Brian Trueman. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anyegolu. Our guest today is Brian Trueman, a man who's dedicated a significant part of his life to bringing European and African cultures together. His life could read like a multiple award-winning novel. He was born and brought up in his early years in Nigeria, and his story is sometimes funny, sometimes painful, an account of the collision and collusion between races and cultures. It's set in Nigeria in the 1960s, in a country emerging from colonialism, still ragged from ethnic conflict, a conflict that would eventually culminate in all-out war in 1967, forcing Brian to leave and return to, in his mind, the alien world of Britain. a world he was not used to and in which he was surprised to find so many white people. Well, let's pick up the story now with Brian Trueman, who's in our London studios. Thank you very much indeed, Brian, for staying with us. But of course, there you were returning to the UK. Not everyone in Britain was open and friendly and racially unbiased like you. I mean, there was a lot of racism around. You were returning to the UK at a time of the rivers of blood, Enoch Powell, anti-immigrant, quite racial rhetoric. I mean, would you say you became much more political at that time, putting forward the black-white sort of idealistic world that was constantly being disavowed around you?
When I grew up in my school, from the age of 7 through to the age of 18, before going off to college, anybody that came into the school who was either African or Caribbean or Indian, I always made friends straight away. They just fitted in with me and I fitted in with them. So yeah, I think I did prioritize that, and I think that's stayed part of who I am the whole of my life. And that's not just with regards to race, it's regards to anybody's background, is to just accept people for who they are and to love them and to give them kindness and understanding. And where did that come from? It came from my childhood. I'm sure my mum and dad played a huge part in that, but the culture of Nigeria is all inclusive. That's what I found. I got accepted just like they got accepted, and I just think in life you can live a negative life or you can live a positive life, and I just don't want to go down that road of being negative. People are special. Every person has a right to life, and if you can be a stepping stone for them and them for you, and you just enjoy life together, and you can go through, you know, sometimes you cry with each other, sometimes you laugh with each other. It's about relationship at the end of the day.
Nevertheless,
and
Brian, I mean,
kills relationship.
Yes, as you and I know, I mean, you know, that's a jolly nice way to see the world, but not everybody sees the world that way. And here you were returning to the UK at a time of great racial sort of turmoil, but still you persisted. I mean, why did you persist, not so much in making political statements, but living a life that was clearly and evidently embracing of people of color, if you like, this pan-African, pan-global perspective?
Without a doubt, there was a lot of prejudice, and a lot of the news and a lot of the comedy programs in the 70s, you know, they portrayed it, and a lot of people found it, you know, great humor in the British culture. But where did that root come from? You know, Madiba, he spoke these words, and he said prejudice doesn't just occur, it's taught, it's learnt, and that's the root of it. So I never picked that up in the whole of my life. There's no need for it, and I'm not just talking prejudice about the different cultures. It's like, you know, if you've got the LGBT community, that everybody's talking negatively about them, and there's a group of people that we should be caring about and loving, and just being kind to people with disabilities. We have this prejudice and we make a mockery of it. You know what? These are real people. They've got a heartbeat. They've got emotions. And why should we crush a person? Why not do something different? Why not build a person up? Why not go that extra mile and make somebody's life feel special? That doesn't cost anything. I tell you what, the rewards are amazing. You know, love will always bring you great rewards. Anger and bitterness and prejudice, they'll just eat away at you. And I think most of the time that comes out sideways in illnesses and sicknesses with a lot of people. But that bitterness, that root of bitterness, that's taught. You come into a culture and somebody said you've got to behave like this, So people grow up that way. Well, I don't agree with that. We have choices. We can live a prejudiced life, or we can live a free life and enjoy it. And I think this world can do with people just standing up and saying it as it needs to be said. Sometimes we say things because we just got to fit in with the peer pressure. Well, I don't fit in with peer pressure. I've never been afraid to speak the truth. And we can change things. So somebody's got to start somewhere. I remember Mother Teresa was chastised once by a guy who was interviewing her and said this. Said, but Mother Teresa, all this suffering in the world, you're just but a drop in the ocean to the needs that these people have. And immediately she replied, and I love this, she said this, she said, you know what? If every one of us did a little drop, we could be a tidal wave of love to this whole world. Well, let's just do our little drop. Let's just love the one in front of us. Let's change the world. We don't have to buy into all the negative and all the bad things and this is the way it is. Well, let's change the way it is. And
so
I would stand. I'd stand spiritually, politically, right across the board.
I expect soon enough, Brian, you're probably going to get lots of emails
and speaking love.
I was going to say soon enough you're going to get lots of emails and texts asking you to start a proper humanist movement, because I expect there'll be a lot of people just listening to you this evening who would probably want to be part of that. But just going forward and talking about you left the Nigeria and you were a big fan of Nigerian food. You still are, aren't you?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't think you quite heard me there.
Yeah,
I was talking about...
Well, I'm a great fan of food. You can tell by I stood up.
Okay, well, let's...
Yeah, food is lovely. I enjoy food. I enjoy cooking it. I enjoy preparing it. But Nigerian food is exceptional. We took my boys out recently, and we had a meal, Nigerian meal, and just great to be in that environment. Because what you do is you're not, when you eat food, you eat culture. And what was nice is that the variety of foods had all its own stories, especially in my own life, like jollof rice and fufu and the pounded yam and plantain and the peanut stew, okra soup. Just, I love it, and I've got used to the heat, but not so much when it's a bonnet pepper though. That kills.
Well, I have to say that when I was last in London, you actually took me out, which is quite interesting. You took me out to a Nigerian restaurant. You insisted that that's where we would go, and I remember that you and I had okra soup, which is one of my favorites. And I think your sons had jollof rice, and you were also a big fan of goat meat stew, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, goat meat stew, peanut stew. I love peanut stew. My goodness, that is awesome. And food is awesome.
Right. I mean, but what would you say is your favorite Nigerian food? What are you most likely to order if you went to, in other words, if you were going to get a takeaway, what would you most likely order at a Nigerian restaurant?
Yeah, definitely okra soup and peanut stew.
Right.
And loads of jollof rice. I love jollof rice. And only a Nigerian can cook jollof rice properly.
And would it be a combination? Because I can see people here just sort of getting a bit wary of it. Would it be a combination of okra soup and jollof rice, or would you eat the okra soup with fufu and then subsequently eat your jollof rice with goat meat stew, or would you sort of mix them all up, sort of thing?
Oh, no. Fufu and soup first, definitely. Then jollof rice with the main meal. Mind you, I'd have jollof rice with everything if I could have that choice.
Well, it's very strange that I actually...
Maybe open a rice restaurant, a jollof rice restaurant.
Right. I mean, for me, I have to be honest, and people might think this is a bit bizarre, but my preference is always to eat okra soup with white rice. I mean, I can't, it's very difficult sometimes to eat the very heavy sort of, as they call it here, swallow. But I tend, if you asked me, I mean, obviously I would eat that, but if you asked me what I would prefer in terms of eating something with soup, including whether it's a goosey or vegetable or okra, I'd eat it with white rice.
Yeah, I think you become too British, to be honest, Charles.
I like that. Ouch. Yeah, well, you should maybe, we'll talk a bit more about going out to Nigerian restaurants and talk a lot more about your life. But I think it's time for us to take another break. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with Brian Trueman, the British Nigerian Brit. Stay with us. Now, at one stage, our guest today, Brian Trueman, was looking for ways to bring people together in Europe and Africa, and he decided to join up with the German evangelist Reinhard Bonnke, traveling to Nigeria and around Africa preaching that one world was God's world. But then Brian became disillusioned with the direction that evangelism was taking, especially the focus on money and religion rather than on spiritualism. So he left, but he has continued to work towards bringing the cultures of Europe and Africa together in a more secular world. Well, let's give him a bit of nostalgia. Here's Reinhard Bonnke doing his business in Nigeria on one of the trips in which he was accompanied by Brian Trueman.
Tonight you may come here as weak as can be. You will go home like a conqueror with Jesus inside of you.
And that's a little nostalgia there for Brian Trueman, who's with me in our London studios. And Brian, just before we went on a break, we were talking about how your life had moved from Nigeria to England, continuing in rural England, predictable, safe, white picket fences all around sort of thing. But you were restless and you wanted to renew your connection to the African continent, and so you returned to Nigeria in the year 2000. Tell us about that.
Well, actually, I returned. There was always a passion in me. At 19, I had an incredible encounter with Jesus and just got totally and radically born again, and a fire burned inside of me, the love of the Father for the people. And I just had this desire for Africa as a whole. And Reinhard was an incredible inspiration to me as a young man. And I so honor him and his love and devotion, and the whole of the CFAN team, fantastic team. I learned a lot from them. I was with another organization called Worldwide Harvest Ministries, and so I was back out there in 94 through to 96, and it was a part of my life that took me back onto a continent that I absolutely loved and adored. So I was in a place called Guinea-Bissau, and we saw amazing things happen there. But I've got to be honest. I came back into the culture of English church and religion and stuff like that, and something was just eating away inside of me. You know, it's about relationship. It's about a purity, and all I had was like a religion. You've got to do this. You've got to do that. This is right. That's wrong. You've got to sit in your place. Do as you're told. If you're not on the team or you're not out there doing it, then you're not a success. And to me, religion kills, but there is a spirituality. There is the love of Jesus, the love of the Father, and the love of the Holy Spirit that changes you forever, and it takes you into a relationship that just flows with love. And love is the most powerful thing on the face of this earth. It will change everything. Greater love has no man than he lays down his life for another. This is
Right. Just had a bit of an interruption in the signal there. I don't know if Brian can hear me now, if he's back. Okay, well, there is a bit of we're having a bit of an interruption there. That's what happens when you have a very long interview. The signal sometimes goes a bit wonky, and that clearly is the case of what is happening in England now. But I'm talking to Brian Trueman, the humanist. And Brian, I apologize there. We lost you for a minute. We lost the signal. So you kind of faded off. But let me bring you up to speed with where we are. You were talking about your return to Nigeria in the year 2000, and beyond the sort of the epiphany of religion that you had at the time, you were living in Nigeria in the 60s, a time when many people considered to be a fairly idealistic period in this country's history. Were you disappointed with the Nigeria that you saw as opposed to the one that you left in 1967? In other words, the one that you saw in the year 2000, because I know that you returned to Enugu, and you know, all the streets were broken up, and you know, potholes everywhere, and the buildings were all sort of scrummy and not maintained and so on. I mean, that was a fairly dark period in Enugu's history, from what I understand.
Yeah, without a doubt, we both Linda and I were quite shocked at the poverty, and you know, what was once my home, and from what I can remember and what I saw, the poverty was really strife. I mean, people sleeping under, you know, awful conditions. And what does that mean? I know that not just Nigeria and not just Africa, but the whole world seems to have gone through incredible change. You've got power politics now, and we've lost the real statesman who would lead a nation because it's a nation, and everything seems to have been lost now. Our struggle, and I think over Africa we talk about tribalism, but in this country it's just the same, you know, and across Europe. What we need is pure hearts in politics, and do just say things and get them popular, and they can wear badges on their chest of honor. That isn't what we need. We need radical people who will have the privilege to serve for the better. There's no need for this to be degenerating. We have great resources, we have great talent out there, and we should see it regenerating. But what you have to do is you have to put the heart of the nation first, not second. And that's a tremendous step to take. You know, people get into power struggles, and money and just everything starts to envelop them. And you know, it is true that the love of money is the root of all evil. But there's one thing: if you have got a man with a righteous heart and an unrighteous heart, a good heart and a bad heart, you put money into the good heart, he'll serve it for good. You put money into the bad heart, he'll serve it for bad. Money's not the problem. It's the love of money. And, you know, unless we're talking the truth, things will never change. So if we stay the same old, then, you know, we'll just carry on doing what we are. I'm not like that. I think there's greatness in every nation. And I think that, especially Nigeria is the greatest populace, but I also think it can be an incredible country to change the world, not just its own country. The quality of people that are amazing. I'm not saying everywhere else isn't. It's just that's my perspective. That's
right,
my
Brian. I'm going to come in there just for a minute because we've had a bit of a challenge with the signal there, but we've literally got about a minute or so left. Just before we go. I know that you've been showing much concern, not just for Africa, but for a lot of people around the world. And you've recently focused on trying to help the multinational victims of the Grenfell fire disaster in the UK. Just very briefly tell us about that before we go.
Yeah, very simple. There's an organisation called Connect Me To, headed up by Al Fuji and Diana Claudius, and they're both very good friends. They're open to the Curve community, which is part of the Grenfell community, and they invited me in because I specialise in interior fit-outs for a company that does high-end interior fit-outs across the nation, but predominantly London. And as soon as I walked in, I just contacted the tragedy of Grenfell, and we as a whole nation know that tragedy, but to touch the very heart of it and to meet the people, it blew me away. But do you know what blew me away more than anything? The incredible kindness and love that these people had. You know, there was a camaraderie, and there were so many mixed races there.
Right.
I think in North Kensington there's like 92 languages spoken.
Well, Brian, that's a good note to end on, because again the signal is breaking up. But I want to thank you very much indeed. Brian Trueman talking to me there from our studios in London. Well, that's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again for a fresh edition tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja and London, bye-bye and thank you for watching.